chef threw Black waiter's uniform in the trash. 24 hours later, he returned as the new restaurant owner. The uniform landed in the bin with the sound of something final. Not a dramatic throw, not a scene. Just a chef in a white double-breasted coat pulling a folded black shirt and a pair of pressed trousers from under his arm and dropping them into the large gray waste bin beside the kitchen pass, the way you'd discard something that had already stopped being useful. He did not look at the man he was doing it to. He looked past him, at the line, at the tickets, at the kitchen that he had run for 11 years, and that he believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been seriously questioned in his own domain, would continue to be his to run for 11 more. "You're done," he said. "Security will see you out." The man whose uniform had just been thrown away was standing 2 feet from the bin. He was 34 years old. He was wearing the black shirt and trousers that had been removed from under the chef's arm, because he had been in them all evening, and now they were in the trash, and the chef had turned back to his station as though the conversation had already ended. His name was Darnell Achebe. He had been waiting tables at Oiseau for 3 years. He had worked the floor with a precision and a warmth that the regular clientele, the kind of clientele Oiseau attracted, the kind who booked 6 weeks out and requested specific tables and sent back a bottle of wine not because it was bad, but because they had come to rely on as part of the experience. He knew their names. He knew the anniversary reservations, and the first date anxieties, and the business dinners where someone needed to feel important. He had covered shifts no one else would take. He had stayed late without complaint. He had, on 2 separate occasions, brought in more in tips in a single service than the chef's own sous chef earned in a week. And now his uniform was in the trash, and a chef named Roland Beaumont was plating a sauce reduction with his back to him. And Darnell was standing in a kitchen that smelled of butter and thyme and the specific tension that accumulates in enclosed spaces where power goes. Unquestioned, he reached into the bin. He took the shirt and the trousers back out, folded them under his arm, and walked out of the kitchen through the service corridor and out into the cool of the Atlanta evening without saying a single word. "Yo, hold on. You see what he just did?" He didn't give Beaumont the reaction he was looking for. Not one word. Let's back up and understand exactly who Darnell Achebe was, because this story starts a long time before that kitchen. Darnell's mother was named Comfort Achebe, and she had come to Atlanta from Lagos in 1987 with a nursing qualification, $300 in a zippered pouch sewn into the lining of her bag, and the name of a cousin in Decatur, who had promised to let her sleep on his couch until she found her footing. The cousin's couch turned out to be a cot in a room he shared with 2 other men, and Comfort slept on it for 6 weeks while she studied for her U.S. licensing exams and took double shifts at a care facility in Clarkston that paid less than it had advertised and expected more than it had said. She passed her exams on the first attempt. She moved into a studio apartment in East Atlanta. She worked and she studied more, and she worked again. By the time Darnell was born in 1990, she had a full-time position at Grady Memorial and a small apartment with a kitchen window that caught the afternoon light, and she had developed the habit, which she maintained for the rest of her life, of cooking a proper meal every Sunday regardless of how long the preceding week had been. Not because Sundays were easy, because Sundays were the day she chose to demonstrate, to herself and to her son, that the life she was building was real. Darnell grew up in that kitchen. He grew up watching his mother move between the stove and the counter with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make space work, who could produce a meal for 6 people in a kitchen built for 1 without appearing to rush. He learned from her, without being explicitly taught, that feeding people was an act of intention. You thought about what someone needed. You thought about what would make them feel something. You translated that thought into something you could put in front of them. He was not, as a child, someone who announced plans. He did not tell his mother he wanted to work in restaurants. He did not have a revelation. He simply went toward the thing that felt right the way water goes toward lower ground, not by deciding, but by following the path that was already there. He studied hospitality management at Georgia State and graduated in 2012 with a solid GPA and a more than solid understanding of how restaurants actually worked, which he had developed over 3 years of weekend and evening work at a series of increasingly serious establishments across Atlanta. By the time he walked across the graduation stage, he had worked in 4 restaurants, had been promoted in 3 of them, and had developed a specific expertise in front-of-house operations that his professors had noted was unusual in someone his age. What they were observing, without fully articulating it, was that Darnell understood the economics of a dining room in a way that most people who worked in them did not. He understood that the floor was not just the delivery mechanism for the kitchen's output. It was the whole experience, the pacing, the reading of the table, the decision about when to approach and when to give space, the management of a dining room that was running full service, without letting any single table feel like they were sharing the chef's attention with anyone else. He understood that the margin in a high-end restaurant lived on that floor as much as it lived in the kitchen, and that the people who ran the floor well were chronically undervalued relative to the people who ran the kitchen. He had been keeping, since his second year at Georgia State, a notebook in which he documented what he observed, not just operational notes, bigger things, the cost structure of the restaurants he worked in, the gap between what a place charged and what it spent, the way certain neighborhoods in Atlanta were changing, and what kinds of dining concepts were ahead of or behind those changes. The specific profile of the empty storefronts in the old Fourth Ward and Summerhill that he passed on his commute and that he thought about more than he let on to anyone. He showed the notebook to exactly one person, his mother. She read it on a Sunday afternoon while he sat at her kitchen table, and she turned the pages without rushing, and when she finished she looked at him. For a moment in the way that only she could look at him, with all of her attention, which was a considerable quantity. And she said, "You know what you're doing, now you need the money." He knew that. He was working on it. But first, he needed the experience that would make the money take him seriously. Which was how he ended up at Oiseau. Oiseau was the kind of restaurant that existed as a statement. Not a loud statement. The dining room was muted, the lighting warm and deliberate, the menu printed on cardstock, without prices on the version given to guests who were not hosting the table. It had been opened in 2010 by a restaurateur named Gerald Fitch, who had the capital and the real estate contacts and the business instinct, and by Roland Beaumont, who had the culinary reputation and the ego to match it, and who functioned, in the years that followed, as the public face of the enterprise in the way that chefs had learned to monetize their personalities through television and press, and the kind of carefully managed mystique that translated into covers booked months in advance. Beaumont had trained in Lyon and cooked in Paris, and arrived in Atlanta in 2007 with a James Beard nomination and a management style that the kitchen staff absorbed without complaint because that was simply how serious kitchens worked, or were believed to work. He was exacting. He was often unkind. He had a specific vocabulary for criticism that he deployed in service rather than in private, because public correction was how he maintained the hierarchy that kept the kitchen running at the pace he required. Darnell had worked under this atmosphere for 3 years without incident, which is not to say without observation. He observed Beaumont, the way he observed everything in a professional setting, carefully, comprehensively, and without announcing what he was learning. He observed that Beaumont's creative output had peaked somewhere around 2018, and that the menu had not meaningfully evolved since. He observed that the wine program was outdated relative to what Atlanta's dining clientele had come to expect. He observed that the front-of-house experience, for all that he and his colleagues worked to make it excellent, was constrained by a physical layout and a service philosophy that belonged to a different era of the restaurant's life. He observed that Oiseau was a good restaurant running on the fumes of a reputation it had not renewed in several years. He also observed that Gerald Fitch, who owned the majority stake in the business, and who appeared at the restaurant 2 or 3 times a week for dinner but rarely for operational meetings, had been having conversations in recent months with a commercial property broker about the lease renewal on the building. The lease was coming up. The terms being discussed were substantially higher than the current arrangement, and Oiseau, for all its reputation, was not generating the margins that would make a significantly higher rent sustainable without a meaningful change to the business. Darnell had not been privy to these conversations. He had gathered the outline of them from fragments. A phone call Gerald took at the bar. One evening, a reference to the broker's name in a document that had been left on the host stand, a conversation between Beaumont and the general manager that went quiet when Darnell came within earshot. He was a man who paid attention for a living. He paid attention. What had led to the uniform in the bin on that particular Thursday evening was a complaint. A table of 4 had sent back a dish, not because the food was poor, but because one of the guests had an allergy that had been communicated to the kitchen and that had been present in the sauce anyway. Darnell had handled it exactly as he should have, calmly, without drawing attention to the table, with a replacement dish and a conversation with the guest that resolved the situation to the point where the table left a note praising the professionalism of the service. He had also, following restaurant protocol, filed an incident note with the manager. Beaumont had seen the incident note. He had interpreted it not as a procedural record but as an act of insubordination, an accusation against his kitchen, committed to writing by a member of the floor staff. He had waited until the service was done and the kitchen was breaking down, and then he had gone to the linen room, where Darnell was doing his end-of-shift duties. And he had taken the spare uniform from the shelf, and he had walked back to the kitchen, and he had put it in the bin. The incident note remained on file. The allergy was documented. The timeline was clear. Beaumont had simply decided that the bin was the last word in the conversation. He was wrong about that. Darnell went home that night to the apartment in Summerhill that he had rented for 4 years, and he sat at the table he used as a desk, and he opened his notebook, the one that had started at Georgia State, and that now ran to nearly 3 volumes, and he looked at the section he had been working on for the better part of 8 months. It was a business plan, not a rough outline. A complete structured document, market analysis, concept definition, operational model, financial projections, capital requirements, target location. He had been developing it methodically, the way his mother approached everything she undertook. Not rushing toward completion, but building the thing, so thoroughly that when it was done, it could bear the weight of being real. The concept was a neighborhood restaurant in Summerhill, not fine dining in the oiseau mode, not exclusionary, not structured around a celebrity chef's ego, but a serious place. A place where the food reflected the neighborhood's history and the community it was becoming, where the service was warm and informed, rather than formal and performative, where the economics were designed to work for the business and for the people who worked in it, rather than just for the person at the top of the hierarchy. He had a name for it. He had a menu outline. He had a projected cost structure. He had been saving for 6 years and had a number in a business account that was meaningful but not sufficient. What he had not yet had was the catalyst, the thing that shifts a plan from the notebook stage to the phone call stage. He closed the notebook. He looked at the wall for a while. He thought about his mother's kitchen and the afternoon light through the window and the way she had turned the pages without rushing. Then he picked up his phone and sent a text message to a man named James Okafor. James was 47 years old and ran a small but serious investment fund called Bedrock Capital that focused specifically on food and beverage, businesses in underserved Atlanta neighborhoods. He and Darnell had met 3 years earlier at a community development forum in East Point, and they had stayed in loose but genuine contact since. The kind of contact where two people who respect each other's thinking check in every few months and mean it. The text said, "I think I'm ready. Can we talk this week?" James replied within 20 minutes. "Been waiting for this text. Thursday morning, my office." It was Friday night when Darnell sent the message. Thursday was 6 days away. He had work to do. He spent the weekend refining the plan. He went through every assumption, every number, every projection, and he stress-tested them against current Atlanta market data and against the specific economics of the Summerhill location he had identified. He updated the lease cost estimates. He revised the staffing model. He added a section on community engagement, not as a marketing strategy but as an operational philosophy, a description of how the restaurant would function as a genuine part of the neighborhood rather than a destination that happened to be located in it. He called his mother on Sunday, not to tell her everything, to have dinner. She made jollof rice and fried plantains, and they sat at the table where he had grown up doing homework, and she talked about her week and he listened, in the way that he always listened to her, with his full attention, because she had given him hers all his life, and it was the least he could return. He did not mention the uniform in the bin. He would tell her eventually, but not yet. On Thursday morning, he was in James Okafor's office on the second floor of a building in Castleberry Hill at 9 o'clock, with a printed copy of the plan and a laptop and 3 years of personal financial records. The meeting lasted 4 hours. James asked the kind of questions that good investors ask. Not softballs, not tests designed to catch someone out, but genuine interrogations of the plan's assumptions that made the plan better in the answering of them. At the end of the 4 hours, James leaned back in his chair and looked at the document on the table between them. "You know what I'm going to say," James said. Darnell said he thought he did. "The concept is right," James said. "The location is right. The timing is right. And you've done the work in a way that most people who walk through that door haven't done it." He paused. "What I haven't heard you talk about is the space. Do you have a space?" Darnell said he had an address in mind. "Have you contacted the owner?" He said not yet. James nodded slowly. "There's something you should probably know," he said. He picked up his phone and showed Darnell something on the screen. A listing from a commercial property broker. A restaurant space in the Old Fourth Ward. Full kitchen, existing liquor license, dining room for 80 covers, private events capacity. The address was the same one as Wasso. Man, can you believe that? The building he just got fired from is the same building coming available. I want you to hear what happened next, 'cause this is where it all lines up. The story of how the Wasso building came to be available was, in the end, a simple one. Gerald Fitch had been carrying the weight of a business that was not performing at the level its lease cost required for the better part of 2 years. The incoming lease rate was 30% above the current one. He had commissioned 2 separate financial reviews of the restaurant's operations, and both had reached the same conclusion. Wasso's revenue was not going to scale to match the new terms, without a fundamental restructuring of the concept, which Roland Beaumont was not willing to entertain, because Beaumont's identity was so thoroughly entangled with the restaurant, as it existed that changing it in any meaningful way felt to him like a kind of erasure. Gerald had given Beaumont the numbers. Beaumont had argued that the answer was more press coverage and a new tasting menu. Gerald had explained, with the patience of a man who had spent 12 years managing a difficult partnership, that press coverage did not cover a 30% rent increase. The partnership had dissolved, quietly and with lawyers, in the week before Darnell's uniform landed in the bin. Beaumont did not know, when he made that gesture in the kitchen, that he had already lost the restaurant. He was performing authority in a space that was no longer his to govern. Gerald Fitch listed the building through a broker and waited for offers. He wanted to sell to someone who would actually use the space, someone who had a real concept, real operational experience, and real skin in the game. He had built something in building, and he did not want to watch it become a pop-up venue or a co-working space or any of the other things that happen to restaurants, when people who did not understand them acquired them. James Okafor called Gerald Fitch on the afternoon of the Thursday meeting. He had known Gerald professionally for years, in the small world way that Atlanta's business community tended to produce. He described what he had been looking at that morning. He described the plan. He described the person who had built it. Gerald said he would like to meet. The meeting happened the following Monday. It was not in a boardroom or a formal office. It was in the Wasso dining room itself, at 11 in the morning, with the chairs still up on the tables, and the afternoon light coming through the windows, at an angle that made the whole room look like something. Between what it had been and what it might become, Darnell brought the plan. He also brought something else, a single meal, prepared in the Wasso kitchen with Gerald's permission, using the equipment that was already there. Not a formal tasting, not a performance. A Monday morning breakfast, eggs, grits, a hot sauce he had been developing for 2 years using a recipe his mother had carried in her memory from Lagos, fresh bread from a bakery in Summerhill run by a woman he knew. He put it on the pass and he served it on the plates that were still in the cabinet, and he sat across from Gerald Fitch and they ate together while they talked. Gerald asked about the concept. Darnell explained it. Gerald asked about the community engagement section of the plan, which he had read over the weekend and which he kept returning to with specific questions. Darnell answered them. Gerald asked about the staffing philosophy, whether Darnell intended to build a kitchen culture that was different. from what the space had seen before. Darnell said yes, and he described how and why. Gerald ate the last of his grits. He put his fork down. He looked at the room for a moment as though he was measuring the distance between what it had been and what Darnell was describing. The kitchen equipment alone is worth something, Gerald said. I know, Darnell said. I worked around it for 3 years. Gerald looked at him. Darnell said, I was on the floor here until last Thursday. There was a pause. Gerald processed this. Beaumont let you go? He put my uniform in the trash during breakdown and told security to walk me out. The reason, if you want to call it that, was an incident report I filed about an allergy that came back in a dish after it had been flagged. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had built things and had spent 12 years watching someone else manage the human infrastructure of one of those things in a way he had often found uncomfortable and had not intervened on as directly as he might have. He understood in this moment that the man sitting across from him had absorbed more than a dropped uniform. He had absorbed 11 years of a kitchen culture that Gerald had permitted, and he had absorbed it with enough grace to still be here, with a 400-page business plan and a hot sauce made from his mother's recipe. Tell me about the lease structure you need, Gerald said. The negotiation took 3 weeks. James Okafor handled the financial architecture. A second investor, a woman named Patricia Holt, who ran a real estate development fund focused on Black-owned commercial enterprises in Atlanta and who James had brought in during the second week, took a stake that brought the capital structure to the level the deal required. Gerald Fitch agreed to a seller-financed portion of the purchase price that reflected his genuine interest in the outcome rather than just the transaction. Darnell signed the papers on a Wednesday afternoon in the offices of a real estate attorney on Peachtree Street. He signed them with a pen his mother had brought as a gift, still in the cardboard tube it had come in when she ordered it engraved 23 years ago for a different occasion that had never come. She had been keeping it for the right moment. She sat beside him when he signed. He did not cry. His mother did not cry either. She pressed both hands flat on the table when the last page was done, and she looked at the stack of documents and then at her son, and she breathed once, the way a person breathes when they have been holding something carefully for a long time and can finally, for the moment, put it down. Outside the building on the street, she took his hand and held it for a few seconds, the way she had when he was small, and then she let go and they walked to the car. Roland Beaumont heard about the sale from his former sous chef, who heard about it from the broker's assistant, who had mentioned it in passing at an industry event the week before the papers were signed. By the time the information reached Beaumont, it had passed through enough people that it arrived not as gossip, but as established fact, and he spent 20 minutes on a Tuesday evening standing in the kitchen of his temporary consulting position at a hotel restaurant in Buckhead, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with the timeline of events as he had understood them. The timeline, when he reconstructed it, was as follows. Gerald Fitch had been in dissolution discussions with the partnership's lawyers at the same time that Beaumont had been firing Darnell. The building had been listed the same week. The buyer, a name Beaumont did not recognize, a 23-word business entity that meant nothing to him, had been identified within days. The sale had proceeded without Beaumont's knowledge or involvement because he was no longer a party to it. He thought about the uniform he had put in the bin. He thought about the back of Darnell's head as he walked out through the service corridor. He thought about the incident note, which he had found petty and confrontational, and which had turned out to be a minor procedural document filed by someone who had bigger things on his mind. There was nothing for him to say or do. The story had not required his awareness to complete itself. He went back to the hotel kitchen. The tickets were backing up. Darnell opened the restaurant 6 months after signing. He renamed it. He called it Abuja, after the city his father had grown up in, a name he had carried at the back of his plans for years without being entirely sure why until the moment it was the only name that made sense. The renovation took 12 weeks. He kept the kitchen equipment and rebuilt the dining room. Same bones, different language. Out went the formal, slightly airless arrangement of the Oiseau years. In came a room that felt like a place you could stay in. Warm lighting, tables spaced for conversation, a counter along the south wall where solo diners could sit and watch the open kitchen without being on display. The bar was expanded and restocked with a wine list that reflected what Atlanta's dining clientele had actually been drinking for the past 5 years, rather than the list that had last been updated in 2019. The menu was his, fully and without compromise. West African influences in the technique in the pantry, but not as theme, as foundation. The jollof base that appeared in 3 different forms on the menu. The suya spice that did something unexpected to a short rib. The hot sauce in a small ceramic ramekin that arrived with the bread, made from Comfort Achibi's Lagos recipe. That became the first thing regulars mentioned when they recommended the restaurant to someone new. He hired a kitchen team led by a young chef named Amara, who had been cooking at a smaller restaurant in East Atlanta and whose palate and work ethic Darnell had observed carefully over 2 years before making the approach. He built the front-of-house team himself, from scratch, from people he had known across his years on the floor, people who understood that the dining room was not a delivery mechanism but an experience. With its own integrity, he instituted a profit-sharing structure for all full-time staff, not as a gesture, as a policy, built into the business model. Because he had spent 3 years watching what it cost people to work in a place where the economics of their labor primarily benefited someone they rarely saw. The opening was not reviewed immediately. Darnell had not sought press in the first month. He wanted the restaurant to be ready, not just technically functional but genuinely itself. Before anyone outside the neighborhood's own word of mouth started shaping how it was understood. He wanted the regular tables, the anniversary couples, the solo diners at the counter, to establish themselves first. By the second month, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had a reviewer in. The review ran on a Thursday. It gave the food 4 stars out of 5 and the service 5 out of 5. And it described the dining room as the most comfortable room opened in Atlanta in 2 years. The line that people quoted most on social media was, "This is the rare restaurant that seems to understand exactly what it wants to be, and has the craft to be it fully." Comfort Achibi read the review at her kitchen table on Thursday morning. She read it twice, then she cut it out, physically, with scissors, from the printed edition she had bought from the newsstand on her way to work. And she put it in the zippered pouch that she had carried from Lagos in 1987 and that she still kept in the inner pocket of her winter coat. The pouch was not empty. It had not been empty for 34 years. It contained the things she had decided were worth carrying. There was room, it turned out, for one more. 18 months after opening, Abuja was fully booked 6 weeks out. The private event space, a room off the main dining room that Darnell had designed for community use at below. Market rates on Sunday afternoons, had hosted 4 neighborhood association meetings, 2 small business development workshops, a graduation celebration for 12 families from a culinary training program Darnell had co-sponsored with a community college in southwest Atlanta, and 1 Sunday supper that Comfort Achibi cooked herself, with her son working the pass, for 40 members of the Summerhill Neighborhood Coalition, who had spent a year advocating for the preservation of affordable commercial space in the area. The culinary training program was Darnell's. He had designed it with the community college and with Patricia Holt's fund, and it provided 12 weeks of professional kitchen training to residents from underserved Atlanta neighborhoods, with guaranteed interview placement at Abuja and a network of other participating restaurants for graduates. In its first full year, 21 students completed the program. 14 were placed in professional kitchens within 60 days of graduation. Gerald Fitch came to the restaurant for dinner in its 8th month. He came alone on a Tuesday and sat at the counter. He ordered the short rib and the hot sauce bread and a glass of wine from the updated list. He did not announce himself. Darnell saw him from the kitchen and sent out a small extra course, the jollof-based dish that was his most direct homage to his mother's Sunday cooking, with a note that said simply, "Thank you for the room." Gerald sat at the counter for 2 hours. He ate everything. He tipped 40% and left without a fuss. He called Darnell the next morning. "I sold to the right person," he said. Darnell said he intended to make sure that remained true. Roland Beaumont's name came up once, in a profile of Darnell published in a food magazine in the restaurant's 2nd year. The journalist, who had done their research, asked Darnell whether the way he had left Oiseau was part of what had accelerated his decision to move forward with his own place. Darnell considered the question for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that sometimes someone removes something from you, and what you find out is that you were the one carrying it. The uniform was just a uniform. What mattered was what I had in my notebook. He paused, and what my mother taught me about what a kitchen was actually for. The magazine ran a photograph alongside the profile. It showed Darnell standing in the Abuja dining room at end of service, the chairs still full, the light low and warm, his hand resting on the back of one of the counter stools. He was looking at something just past the camera, in the way that people look when they are thinking about what comes next. His mother had a copy on her refrigerator. She had put it next to the review, which she had printed out and laminated after the original newsprint copy started to soften at the fold. She never threw anything away that was worth keeping. And that's Darnell Achebe. That's Abuja. That's what happens when someone mistakes a uniform for the whole story. This story is fiction, but every truth in it is real. The people who get dismissed in kitchens and corridors and conference rooms, who were never the small thing, someone decided they were. The patience it takes to keep building. When someone tries to make you feel like you have nothing to build with. The notebooks that survive the bins. They always do. Here's my question for you. Has anyone ever underestimated what you were building, written you off before you were done? I want to hear about it in the comments. Drop your story. I read every single one. If this hit home, hit the like button. Share it with someone who's in the middle of building something and needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. We're just getting started.